Are you ready to record, John?
Yes, I've started it, yes.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces here tonight. Many of you already know me from the Society for the History of Astronomy, but for those of you that don't, I'm Carolyn Kennett, and I'm a writer, researcher and astronomer based in the southwest of the UK. I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then I'm going to hand over to Robert, and then he's going to hand over to Brian. And at the end, we're going to have some Q&A. So if you've got any questions that come up during the talk, feel free to type them in the chat box. And then at the end, I'll run through all the questions all at the end. If that's, I think that's probably the best way because we've got quite a lot of people on rather than doing raised hands. So that was a little bit about me. Robert, most of you will know Robert, but for those of you that don't, he's a professor of history at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. And he's written extensively on the history of astronomy from the 18th century to the present day. He wrote his first paper on Neptune in 1984. In 2020, he was awarded the Doggett Prize for the History of Astronomy by the American Astronomical Society. Brian, who's coming last, he was a research chemist, and he currently sits on the Royal Astronomical Society Heritage Committee. He's also on the policy group for the mega constellations. He is a long-time John Couch Adams scholar and director of the Roseland Observatory in Cornwall, and he also sits on the board of Cornwall Seat of Stars. Before I hand over to the main speakers tonight, I would like to say a little bit about how the book came about and how it formed into the project that it became. The book is primarily considers new developments in the field from an international set of authors, and we hope that it presents a more balanced interpretation of documents, both old and new. Robert is going to talk a little bit about the search for the planet tonight and the discovery. And later on, Brian is going to give us an overview of some of the lesser known aspects of the saga. But first off, it's really key for me to say the role that the SHA played in the coming together of this book. Brian and I first met at an SHA meeting, even though we both live in Cornwall. We met in the 2015 Greenwich meeting, and we struck up a conversation even then about John Couch Adams. Brian was kind enough to take me to John Couch Adams' childhood home and introduce me to the current owners there. And that's Brian stood outside the house. That's probably back in about 2016. And on the left-hand side is an actual painting from when John Couch Adams lived there. It was in this early period that Brian had this idea of bringing together a collected papers volume about John Couch Adams, ready for his bicentenary of his birth in 2020. But that got put to one side because there was issues of costings and things like that, and buying papers off of academic journals and things like that. And it evolved into more of the project what we see today. So if we fast forward a little bit to the SHA Oxford meeting in 2019, and you can see a bit of a table there with some of the people interested in Neptune. There's Bill Sheehan on the left with his wife next to Brian, and then you can see Norma, who is a descendant of John Couch Adams there next to Gerard. So there was a bit of a discussion going on that night about Neptune and John Couch Adams. So Bill had been brought over to talk about Neptune, and after his talk we got together and we all chatted about the idea of a book. And we realized at that stage that that was going to be the easy part, because putting a book together of such magnitude would take, there's far too many strands for one person to take on and to grasp. So Bill brought on board Robert for his expertise, and later on Trudy and myself as editors to assist him. And then we also approached a number of authors to supply material for the book, and it became this international project that it's ended up. There are two further people that I really need to thank for the project itself. The first one is Alan Chapman, the SHA chair, and that was for his guidance throughout of writing the book on Aries, and also for supplying the foreword to the book. The second person I really want to thank is Roger Hutchins, and many of us know Roger quite well. And he has been amazing. He's always been helpful in discussion on email when we've got questions. And he's read through the early manuscripts and come back with critical and insightful ideas about how to make the text better. And without Roger on board, it would have been a much lesser project. So there you have it. This is the book. And we are hoping that it will be out fairly soon. It keeps getting delayed slightly, but that's because of some of the issues with the typesetting, and the typesetting happening in India, which is unfortunately going through a lot of problems, as many of us know. So we're all having to be a little bit patient about this, but looking online, the date is saying August at the moment. So, but hopefully it might end up a little bit sooner than that. I'm now going to hand you over to Robert, so you're going to be in good hands. So I'll stop my screen share and let Robert share his.
So I'm just doing my screen share here. And I'm trying to get to the slideshow. And I need to make the bar at the top go away. I'm not seeming.
If you go along the grey bit at the top, you'll see something called slideshow next to animations. Go a bit further to your right, Robert, with your mouse.
Animation. What did you say, Caroline?
Next to animations, there's something said slideshow. If you click on slideshow.
Oops.
So you move your pointer. That's it.
I'm trying to get this bar to go away so I can get to the slideshow control underneath it.
So, Robert, if you click on where it actually says slideshow on the top bar there, you should be able to have an option there to
run the show. Yeah.
Run the show from the beginning.
Yeah, that's my problem is when I'm looking at my screen, I'm seeing a gray bar across the top which has start video and so on.
Do you want me, because I've got your slides, do you want me to share them and you just tell me when to turn the slide to the next one?
First, are you seeing a bar at the bottom that says notes with some symbols next to it? Because you can start the show 4 symbols over from notes at the bottom.
Let me see. I'm not seeing notes.
I can see your pointer. Your pointer's moving around, but I can see you're now underneath transitions. And if you move to the right, you should see animations, and then the next one says slideshow.
My problem is the bar at the top is just stopping me getting to the slideshow control here. Let me go to more.
Can you minimize this PowerPoint slightly? That's it. You've gone bigger on my one.
That's made it worse.
Yeah, you've gone much bigger on mine. You've got slideshow now, though.
It's not letting me do it.
Yeah, so you should. I just saw it from the beginning.
Okay.
Yes.
Can everybody now see my slides?
Yes, you're fine.
Okay, onward. Onward. Okay, greetings from Western Canada to everybody. And as Caroline said, it's almost 40 years since I wrote my first paper on the discovery of Neptune. So this is a topic I've come back to a number of times, and it's been a great pleasure to work on the book because it means, in a way, in part, revisiting some things already worked on, but also tackling new questions and issues. So first of all, let's go to Oxford. Let's go, in fact, to Oxford in June 1847. Let's go to a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And we're hearing a talk by the president, somebody called Sir Robert Inglis. He was also the MP for Oxford. And he was looking back at the previous year in science. And he said, as I put it on the slide here, that the year had been marked by discovery, the most remarkable perhaps ever made as a result of pure intellect exercise before observation and determining without observation the existence and force of a planet, which existence and which force was subsequently verified by observation. So this gives us, I think, a flavor of just how important the discovery of Neptune was, and in a way how astonishing it was for people at the time, that here was a planet whose existence had been predicted, and lo, the planet did truly exist, and it was found close to the predicted position. And so let me go forward to the actual discovery, and it was made at Berlin, 23rd of September 1846, and we can see on the left the Berlin Observatory, and I'll just get my laser pointer. And here is the Fraunhofer refractor that was used, a 9-inch refractor. It was then in this dome, but it's seen in the photograph on the right at the Deutsches Museum in Munich. And the discovery was made by Heinrich d'Arrest and J.G. Gallet, working together with Hour 21 of the famous Royal Academy Berlin maps, star maps, as a direct result of the prediction by UJJ Leverrier, who's seen on the right here. And I'd be happy to go over some of the circumstances of the actual discovery in the Q&A, if anybody would like to ask about that. Initially, the thought was that the discovery, the observational discovery, had been made solely by Gallet, but in fact, it was d'Arrest and Gallet working together. So it was a method comparing what was actually seen on the sky with what was on the famous Hour 21 of the Berlin maps. There had earlier been an unsuccessful search at the Paris Observatory because Leverrier was attached to the Paris Observatory, and this was obviously a natural thing to do, but the search had been abandoned by the 12th of August, 1846. And the telescope available for the search really wasn't very good anyway. It was a 7.5-inch refract by Lorabor, but it was a bad city site by this point. And so the search, as I say, had been abandoned. But of course, as well as the calculations and predictions by Leverrier, there'd also been a Cambridge mathematician tackling the problem of the irregularities in the motion of Uranus, because it was the irregularities in Uranus's motion that pointed to the existence of a planet beyond Uranus. And the Cambridge mathematician was, of course, John Couch Adams, and he'd got his researches underway even before Leverrier. And in fact, he, as an undergraduate, wrote a famous memorandum where he talked about he'd formed a design of investigating as soon as possible after taking my degree the irregularities in the motion of Uranus. Uranus to try and see if it was due to the action of what he called an undiscovered planet beyond it. And then he actually started work on these calculations in the long summer vacation in 1843. And here, just briefly, I put some of the important steps for Adams, and on the right, some of the important steps for Leverrier. And Adams had completed what was called Hypothesis 1. And he had orbital elements by this point. And on the 22nd of September, 1845, James Challis, who was the observatory director at Cambridge, wrote a letter of introduction for Adams to George Biddell Airy, who was the British Astronomer Royal, the idea being that Adams would briefly discuss his researches with Airy on a journey to Cornwall, going by the Royal Observatory. But Adams missed Airy, and then he tried again, returning from Cornwall on the 21st of October, 1845, but he'd missed him, came back a second time that day, missed him again because Airy was at dinner and Airy's butler did not want to disturb him. And so he left a sheet with orbital elements behind. Airy followed up by writing to him on the 5th of November, 1845, but Adams didn't reply. Meanwhile, Leverrier had started work on the irregularities of the motion of Uranus, and by the 1st of June, 1846, he'd actually got a first approximation to the planet's position, but this is really what he more or less calls a sketch. It's not a detailed calculation, but by the 31st of August, 1846, there's a second paper with a predicted position, which he regards as a much more serious prediction than the initial one in early June. And it should be said that Leverrier was publishing results as he was going along, whereas Adams published nothing ahead of the actual discovery of the planet. Now, only a small number of people knew that there were two predictions for the existence of the supposed planet beyond Uranus. One of them was the Astronomer Royal George Biddell Airy. And it's one thing to have one set of calculations of the existence of a planet, quite another to have two predictions, and the two predictions being relatively close to each other. And so here is an extract from a letter that Airy wrote to William Whewell in June 1846, at the end of June 1846, where he makes this important point here. People's notions have long been turned to the effects of an external planet, and upon this there are two remarkable calculations, one by Adams of St. John's, that is St. John's College, Cambridge. The other is by Leverrier in the Comte Rendu of the 1st of June, 1846. And so we have him pointing out that the results that they've come up with are actually pretty close. And for Airy now, the task is to actually get a search underway. And so here's Airy, and here's James Challis, who is director of the observatory at Cambridge. And so Airy is pressing very hard to get Challis to actually start a search from Cambridge. And I'd be happy to discuss further the reasons why Airy is so intent on a search from Cambridge. And the search does in fact get underway on the 29th of July, 1846, and the telescope that's going to be used is the Northumberland refractor. It's of course a 12-inch refractor, and as David Dewhurst pointed out in 2006, Airy had designed the Northumberland refractor, had overseen its construction as well when he was the director of the observatory at Cambridge. And for certain objects, it was excellent. But for charting a region of the sky, mapping a large area of sky, and in effect creating a star map, it really wasn't very good. And so, as David Dewhurst pointed out, it was singularly unsuitable for the rapid mapping of a large area of sky. And it was going to be an effort to map an area of sky about 30 degrees by 10 degrees, working down to 11th magnitude and doing that 3 times. And it was reckoned that that would consume about 300 hours of work. And those of you who know Cambridge summers, there are not always that many clear nights. And so this was going to take quite a while to actually complete. Now, an interesting point is that there were in fact 2 searches from England. Another one was going on no later than the second week of September 1846 by J.R. Hind. And something's gone awry with the perspective in the image over here, but he had access to what was really a very good telescope, a 7-inch Dollond refractor. And he was the astronomer at George Bishop's private observatory at Regent's Park in London. And so, as I say, he was aware of Leverrier's researches, but he's not aware of Adams's researches, even though he was actually in communication with James Challis about these particular researches. And it's a letter from Hind to the London Times that announces publicly the discovery of the planet, because Hind had received a letter from Brunel at the Berlin Observatory. And here's what he reported: Leverrier's planet was found. And that, as he puts it, this discovery may be justly considered one of the greatest triumphs of theoretical astronomy, which is what it was actually received as. In fact, this grand triumph of theoretical astronomy. Now, a few days after this, Challis wrote to Francois Arago, who we'll be talking about shortly. And here's what he said: the planet was secured, and he's talking now about the Cambridge search. The planet was secured and 2 positions are recorded 6 weeks earlier here than in any other observatory. But Challis had not realized he'd picked up the planet, in fact, on the 4th of August and the 12th of August, because he'd not checked his observations against each other. He goes on in the letter to Arago: the part played by Mr. Adams in the theoretical search after this planet will be considered to justify the suggestion of a name. And he suggests Oceanus. Now, who is Arago? Well, Arago's the director of the Paris Observatory. He's really a very commanding figure in the French Academy of Sciences. And he'd written extensively on issues of discovery and priority. And it was the case that even in the 1840s, rules about what count as a discovery, what do you need to do to establish a discovery, those kinds of rules, which would be accepted later in the 19th century, were still being worked out. But for Arago, the key thing was publication. And he'd already engaged in a famous dispute with other Cambridge professors, including George Biddell Airy, over the composition of water. So he'd written extensively on the history of science. And if you were going to get in a priority dispute, the last person you would want to see on the other side basically was Arago. It was like putting Muhammad Ali at the prime of his boxing career in the ring with a lightweight boxer, and that is in effect what it is when you have Arago against Chalice. And having received Chalice's note from the 5th of October, on the 19th of October, Arago really lays in to Chalice at the French Academy of Sciences, also lays in to Adams. And he points out there had been no mention of Adams's researches before the discovery. And as he puts it, this circumstance alone suffices to end the debate. If you're going to get credit, you've got to publish. And he says, if you abandon that, all is confusion and obscurity. And he refers to Chalice, in his view, exaggerating the merits of what he calls Mr. Adams's clandestine work. And it really is going too far, thinks Arago, to start claiming the name of the planet. And the bad feeling spills over into the newspapers, who begin to suspect there's some sort of plot to steal Leverrier's discovery. And in chapter 5 of our book, James Lecoeur points out that the cartoonists were let loose on an orgy of nationalism and proceeded to attack Adams, defend Leverrier. And so in these cartoons from the journal L'Illustration, we have Adams with his dunce's cap on, looking to find Leverrier's planet. And controversies erupt. And what is all the fuss about? Well, as I mentioned earlier, there are disputes still, controversies still around what actually is a discovery. Who deserves credit? What is a publication? How much is Cambridge mathematics actually worth? But in this fight, it's important to keep in mind that it's not fought out along straightforward national lines. It's not Britain versus France, because a number of people in Britain were very unhappy with the circumstances of the discovery, and they think that because Adams has not published, he really shouldn't be getting credit for the discovery. And also, if we're thinking about the nature of discovery, do you have to actually see something to discover it? And here's a famous quotation from John Herschel, who on the 10th of September, so that's almost 2 weeks before the planet is discovered from Berlin, addresses the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And he's talking about the predictions by Adams and Leverrier, but he doesn't actually name them. But he says, we see the new planet as Columbus saw America from the shores of Spain. Its movements have been felt, trembling along the far-reaching line of our analysis with a certainty hardly inferior to ocular demonstration. And this attitude toward discovery is actually, I think, quite similar to Adams's own. And there's a lot more about this sort of concern for what counts as a discovery actually in the book. Now, what is going on in part is an effort by people like John Herschel as well as Airy to get at least some credit for Adams. And it's worthwhile pointing out that, you know, what is it that Chalice and Adams are actually claiming? And that is laid out at a meeting, in fact, of the Cambridge Philosophical Society. They meet on the 12th of November, 1846. And this is from one of the people who attended the meeting and saw these talks by Adams and talks by Chalice. And as it says here, Adams gave Leverrier the full credit of the discovery, but as a matter of calculation, he claimed for himself the credit of prior independent conjecture. So he's not saying he's the discoverer of the planet, he's not saying he's a co-discoverer, but he wants credit in effect for what he calls prior independent conjecture. And here Chalice says effectively the same and claimed credit on the score of having labored having taken between 3,000 and 4,000 observations by the time the planet was actually found. Now, there were, I think, very interesting aspects of broader discussions around the place of science in British society that overlapped with the discoveries or the issues around the discovery of Neptune. And so we have really some of the heavyweights of the Victorian world weighing in, one of whom was Charles Babbage, who had famously written a book in 1830 called Reflections on the Decline of Science in England and on some of its causes, where he had attacked British institutions of science for falling behind what was going on in France and in the German states. And for Babbage, the message for Babbage was the Neptune story, again, underlined just how bad, in many respects, British scientific institutions were. And he supported Arago's position. He invoked what he called the modern law of discovery. And for him, that meant that discoveries take the date or their date from the time of their first publication. And there are other examples of leading figures who weigh in, including, for example, the Scottish man of science, David Brewster, who loathes, like quite a lot of other people, Cambridge professors, and he uses the discovery of Neptune to attack Airy and Chalice. And there's actually some sentiment that's quite widely shared about the failings of Airy and Chalice in the view of these critics of Cambridge professors. But after this intense period where we'd had all these controversies, we had the outbreak of peace by March 1847. And there was a presentation at the French Academy of Sciences by J.B. Biot, and here's what he says about the discovery. The discovery belongs to him who proclaimed and published it to all, while you, and he's addressing Adams actually, while you, Adams, reserve the secret to yourself. But he goes on to say this inward success ought to give you the consciousness of your power and excite you to direct it to many other great questions yet remaining to be resolved in the system of the world. And he urges Adams to persevere. And that is enough to force a peace settlement. Biot had given Adams some credit. He hadn't given him co-credit. And the piece in the Weekly Journal of the Athenaeum that carried Biot's presentation, or the translation of Biot's presentation, read that the Athenaeum had in fact been pressing very hard for Adams to have credit. And it said the Athenaeum had pressed to reserve to Mr. Adams his place in the history of this great fact, that is the discovery of Neptune. But as Adams's place was now secured in the discovery amongst European philosophers generally, we may wind up our own share in this matter, even though the Athenaeum did not exactly accept its terms. Adams' role had become known, and that was sufficient. And as I say, we have an outbreak of peace, and we have, in fact, a dinner at the Oxford meeting. We saw Robert Inglis's thoughts on the discovery of Neptune at the very start of this little presentation. And in fact, Adams, Leverrier, Airy, and others got together at dinner at that Oxford meeting, and we have a clear display of harmony. Now, why does the discovery of Neptune matter? Let me just mention a couple of examples. I mean, why is this such an important event in the history, not just really of 19th century astronomy, but really the history of 19th century science. So here's John Herschel again, who saw Neptune as this a demonstration of the power of science. It demonstrated in a very clear fashion, even for those people who could not follow the detailed technical calculations by Adams and Leverrier, the fact that they had predicted a planet to exist and it had been found, he argued, he could not conceive anything better calculated to impress the general mind with a respect for the mass of accumulated facts, laws, and methods as they exist at present. And so he goes on, we need some reminder of this kind in England, where a want of faith in the higher theories is still, to a certain degree, our besetting weakness. So Neptune becomes a kind of resource so that people like Herschel can say, look, here is this remarkable power of science. Also, even beyond that, one example, if we look at the writer, poet, Christina Rossetti, and she, in some of her writings and poems, talks about what has been called by one analyst invisible astronomy. And so we find in one of her essays, Seek and Find, from 1879, a clear reference to the discovery of Neptune. A mastermind by the aberration of one celestial body from the line of its independent orbit argued the influential neighborhood of a second luminary till then undiscerned. So this event, the discovery of Neptune, moves far beyond the realms of astronomy and adds to its importance, I think, in terms of our understanding of science in the 19th century. So that is the end of the brief presentation. And so I'd be very happy to take any questions at that point. And so, Caroline, should I just look at the chat and try and answer, or will somebody feed me the question?
I don't mind. Do you want to do your questions now, Robert, and then we go to Brian?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, if we do them all together at the end, that's fine.
Is that
sorry.
okay? Yeah, that's okay. Cool. Okay, Brian, whenever you're ready, you're going to have to unmute yourself.
Are you sharing the screen, Brian? Yeah, unmute yourself, right? Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying that very thing.
Yes. Okay.
That's done it, is it?
Yeah, you've unmuted. You just got to share your screen now.
Yep. Okay. Now all we want is the PowerPoint, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's over here. Right. How about that? Right. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, before I launch into the actual talk, this is presumably what you're looking for, Caroline, is it? Me to crack on now?
Yeah, you need to share your screen though, Phil.
I should have. Hang on.
On the bottom, you should see on mine. It's a green.
If you can't work it out, Brian, I can always share.
Yeah, it's all right. No, I should better get that. I thought I'd. That's it. That's that one. That's that one. And then we go that one. That should be it. It should be.
Are you seeing on the bottom? Are you seeing a green option that says share screen?
I've done that bit.
Oh, have you tried again?
Hang on.
Aha. Right. What's happened?
Should come on. I think it's loaded in, hopefully. Any crackers, isn't it?
You got a.
Brian, if you can't do it, I've got your slides. You'll just have to tell me when to move on. Brian, we've lost Brian.
I'm not sure. Let me have a look. It's there. I can see his name's still there, but it's gone blank.
Yeah, he seems to have disappeared, doesn't he? Give him a moment, and if not, we'll do Robert's questions, and then hopefully Brian is rebooting or whatever's gone on.
Yeah, I think he might have left now. I think he's gone.
Okay, shall we do Robert? Robert, do you mind if we do your questions while we wait for Brian to return? Okay, you'll have to mute yourself, Robert.
Okay,
Yeah,
fine.
there. Okay. Okay, we've got greetings from Haas and Sigma. So that was very early on. Okay, so John Rosenfield says, I have a booklet from Lawrence House Museum, The Two Geniuses of Altenham, John Couch Adams. I don't know who the second genius of Altenham is, but Altenham's a place on Bodmin Moor in Cornwall. So, but yes, I know that Lawrence House did do a nice booklet. Someone arriving late. Okay, so Jay Pasikoff has asked, why didn't Adams reply to Airy's note to him on the 5th of November, 1845?
And that's an excellent question. That's an excellent question. And Bill Sheehan in chapter 4 examines that, because the late Craig Wuff actually found a draft from Adams, which he started in reply to Adams's, Airy's letter, but he never finished it. And so the question is, why didn't he finish it? And so Adams has often been regarded as very shy. At this period, he procrastinated a lot. He was also extremely busy. I mean, a lot later, he said he thought that Airy's query was trivial, but I think that would be really overstating it to call it trivial, because Airy, at the end of June 1846, asked precisely the same question of Leverrier, and Leverrier replies immediately. And so Leverrier certainly didn't think it was trivial, but he didn't reply, and we've got the draft, and this is the first time I think this draft has been presented. And so that really was, as I say, an important find by the late Craig Wuff.
Okay. The next question came from Gerard, and it's some accounts leave dressed out of the story. Any reasons why?
Just mention that Brian's joined us again.
Okay.
So the question is about duress?
Yes. Yes. Why is he left out?
Yeah, so initially, the optical discovery was attributed to Gallet alone, but the first time that there was wide public recognition of the role of duress comes when J. L.E. Dreyer writes a biography, an obituary rather, of duress, and he points out what duress did, and Gallet himself then writes on the events of that night and describes the role that duress played. And it's clear when you read those that duress is very much there. And if you're going to talk about the optical discovery, you really have to talk about duress and Gallet. And so that is something that's discussed extensively, in fact, in chapter 6. It's interesting that what they were doing after they had searched initially for a disk, because Leverrier said, look for a disk and you will find the planet. But they spend some time searching for a disk, but they can't find an object with a disk, at least initially. And so then duress remembers, actually, we have this map, hour 21 of the Berlin Academy maps. And so they grab the map and then they go again, and it's the use of the map that proves decisive.
Okay.
Yep, I agree with that.
Brian, we'll come back to the other questions then. Do you want me to share your slides and you just tell me when to move on?
You might as well. I'll tell you when
Yeah,
to.
because I know sometimes your computer isn't the best. So I will share your slides then, and they're these ones, aren't they? Okay.
Okay.
There we go.
There we
You
go.
just tell me when to move on. I take it I can go to that one. There we go.
Okay, right. Thank you, everybody. And we've got back to it. Before we get cracking into the main talk, I wanted to say thank you to all the Neptunians that have supported this endeavour. It first started when I was about 14 years of age, walking on a scout hike, and I was accosted by a gentleman who said, "You ought to go into that church and see the monuments to the man who discovered Neptune." We didn't. We were too soaked to the skin, to be honest. But nevertheless, we remembered these things and went back to it at a later life. Then, of course, the 99 eclipse, we tried to do a booklet for that. That didn't work either. But now we've elevated ourselves to the dizzy heights of Springer. So there you go. I thought I ought to start with Uranus, because obviously that's where the story generally starts. If you're not going to go back to the childhood of Adams himself. And what we find is that it was obviously discovered years ago, 1780, and it's not been written up very much, the actual discovery in the early days. A couple of bits in the Encyclopedia Britannica, a bit in France as well, they've done a bit, but a lengthy piece appeared in my 1803 copy of Astronomy Explained by Sir Isaac Newton's Principles, and that's by Ferguson. That's a book that Adams himself consulted, and I suspect he probably consulted a newer version than the one I've got. Anyway, we'll just read out a little bit of this for you, just so that you get a flavour of it. And they've discovered a seventh planet, and it's called Georgium Sidus, out of respect to His present Majesty King George III. This planet is still higher in the system than Saturn, 1,565 million miles from the Sun, performs its annual circuit in 83 years and a bit. Consequently, it's in its orbit, it's about 7,000 miles an hour, a bit nippy, and to a good eye, unassisted by the telescope, it appears like a faint star of the fifth magnitude. Yes, you can see it under really good conditions, which we don't often get now. Cannot be distinguished, though, from a fixed star with a magnifying power less than 200. The real diameter subtends an angle no more than 4 seconds of arc to an observer on the Earth, but its real diameter is 34,000 miles, etc., etc. Hence, he may infer that because we're so far away and we're so small, that the Earth cannot be seen by the inhabitants of the Georgian planet, unless their eyes and instruments are considerably better than ours. The orbit is inclined, etc., and so forth. There's quite a bit to it, and the idea of this little talk is a preamble to an article in A&G, and so therefore more of it will appear there. But the key element which appears to apply to the search that we've got, Neptune search, is that in the Herschel Chronicle, we get the following. He was assuming that he was looking at a comet and not at a planet at the time. He saw the comet under power 227, and from experience, I know that the diameter of fixed stars are not proportionally magnified with higher powers as the planets are. Therefore, I put on powers of 460 and 932 and found the diameter of the comet increased in proportion to the power as it ought to be. So if people can sort of just put that in a file, remember that for later. We'll have the next slide, please. There. So that's summarize what I've just said. So next slide. These are just a couple of pictures of the area where Adams was born. It's not exactly the capital of London or anything like that, but a really quite remote area. I don't believe it's changed vastly since his day. I came down from London in the first half of the 20th century, and I don't think that it advanced hardly at all since then. Next, please. We give a map. We've got maps showing the various parts of where he is, but there's little point in sort of going into great detail there. But we have got maps of the area, which is useful if you're actually trying to survey the place. Next, please. This is another one of my acolytes here. We're actually filming a little YouTube by Martin Roos, who is a professional filmmaker as well as a planetary scientist. And we're up here just outside Adams's house to a stone cross considered to be Poliphant stone. Personally, I think it's ordinary granite, but I'm going to get that independently checked. So she stood there and a horse and cart came by with a high-vis tabards and things like that. We thought, gosh. So I was sent to stop the horse, back it up, and it's included in the film. So we're quite, it's only a few minutes long, and it's called Searching for Neptune. So if you get a chance to have a look at that, it's actually on Vimeo, but you can pick it up on the YouTube searches. Next, please. He had a humble beginning, and we've got a picture of his home. And next, thank you. That's his home there. The bit that's sort of facing us, as far as I can tell, is a later addition. And it wasn't there when Adams was born. Don't forget, there was quite a number of brothers and sisters. He did have no idea how they managed to pack them all in to the place during his childhood. Next, please. This is Tregear House. This is where his boss lived, the landlord. He was only a tenant farmer, was his dad, and he seemed to be well regarded by Lethbridge, who was the landlord, because he suddenly realised that Adams Jr. was a pretty smart lad. He was not particularly in favour of education because teachers don't get paid enough. So that was the story then. I think it's changed a bit since then. But anyway, later on, he decided to put his shoulder to the wheel and helped considerably in the education and well-being of the Adams campaign to get to Cambridge. Next, please. He had a schooling in Lan East. That was the school. The guy that accosted me in Lan East was a descendant of the original teacher. And a couple of stories you get there. One is that he went with his brothers and mates to swim in the River Inny, about half a mile away from the school. And he was caught out by the teacher because obviously he hadn't got his phone with him, so he couldn't tell the time, which is one of the problems we have when we're studying history of astronomy or anything else. We tend to look at it through the eyes of the 21st century, and that we cannot do. So, and he got chased back, but he stopped to tie his shoe to make sure that the cane wasn't wrapped around his younger brother's left ear hole. And so that was good. And the next, Devonport, he did quite a bit of stuff there. And his father always reckoned he wasn't going to make a farmer because he would actually go ploughing and let the horses go, and he'd go and sit in a field and think. And of course, they got to the end, turned around and came back again because horses know what they're doing, which is more than he did. He went across to a place called Bridgetown and was met with apparently sort of the elite intellectuals of the area. but nevertheless, John managed to beat them all in their questioning that questions they threw at him, and he came away with pictures and memories of a couple of globes, presumably an astronomical and a terrestrial globe, and some books as well. So that sort of kept him going and was doing quite well there. He went to Devonport, which is Plymouth, to improve his education further, and he joined what's the Mechanics Institute there, and they had a wonderful library. This is where I think that Ferguson's book was to be found, and also one of the early books by William Herschel as well. So that's where he got a lot of his knowledge. He was told by the librarians, no good you taking that book out, boy, because you can't understand it, but he did. So that was good. He cracked on and did exceedingly well there. The Mechanics Institute, founded eventually, turned itself into Plymouth University, and that's doing pretty well considering. And he also was pleased to see Halley's Comet come back, because 1835, that was due back, and lo, it appeared. He was amazed at the mathematics that allowed people to determine when that was coming through again. And when he got to Cambridge, he picked up a copy of a report by Airy on the state of astronomy, in which Uranus got a mention. We don't understand why Uranus is wobbling about like it is. And this set him going. He needed some sort of challenge to push him on to really set himself going in his mathematical career. He became senior wrangler there, St. John's, and scored twice as many marks as the second wrangler. Remember, both Airy and Chalice were senior wranglers, and also first Smith's prizeman, as was John. But nevertheless, they weren't I don't think, as quite such big stars as John turned out to be. And that was fairly important. I think he sort of got a reputation very high there. But we know that one of the things when they were looking for Neptune and so on, trying to do the search, he failed to reply to Airy's radius vector question. Or at least he didn't totally fail. He started and wrote about half a page and then stopped. Now that half page is still in the records office known as Crescent Kerno now, down at Redruth in Cornwall. And it's there for all to see. But he didn't do it. Now, would this have affected the outcome of the search? Don't think so. Because what actually happened was that Chalice searched using Adams's figures first. And we know he picked it up on the 4th and the 12th of August, and again on the 29th, but did not recognize the disc. On the last one, he assumed there might have been a disc to be seen. He discussed it with a guy who wasn't an astronomer, not even a scientist. He was one of the local ministers. And this guy said, well, come on, let's go back and put some more power on your telescope, see whether we can see anything. What a good idea, he said. And then, of course, they amble back. And you've got to remember, there's no British summertime. It's not going to get dark till after 8. They have luckily had some sustenance because, of course, they were waylaid by Mrs. Chalice. And she said, come in and have a cup of tea before you go and freeze to death out there, which they did. And of course, by the time they got the cup of tea sorted out, the clouds had rolled in. Would that have affected it? Probably not. It wasn't dark enough for the planet to be seen until rather later than that. Calculations have been done. And so therefore, he couldn't have seen it, unfortunately, on that day, which was rather annoying, really, because if they had, it wouldn't have been a prior discovery, but it would have been an independent discovery because the news of the finding hadn't been made public in Britain at that time. Next, please. All right, Carolyn.
Is that the right slide?
Yeah, next, there we go. Yeah. This sort of brings us back one stage. The trouble is, in this particular story, various bits are overlapping. When he was at Cambridge, he needed to have a lot of money to keep himself there, and he was doing tutoring and so on. But he managed to get the income from a nearby estate called Batalic. We investigated this, Carolyn and I, and we did some digging around. And what happened was there was a lady who owned the estate, actually died, but leaving the sister of Adams's mother there still as a companion. So she thought, hang on, I can help this business along. If I move into Lidcott with the rest of the family, I can then rent the farm out to another relative, and that money can then go and help fund John's education. And so it was. That worked quite nicely. And I'll just cover Reverend Martin as well while they're going to good. This is where the Lethbridge, the landlord, was actually very helpful. He knew people. And one of the local vicars some miles away had taken a curate who had just come from Cambridge. And he had got his doctorate and so on eventually. And he came, and Lethbridge said to Reverend Martin, please look after John and tutor him so that when he gets to Cambridge, that he does in fact able to do well and not sort of fall foul of any traps and things that might otherwise trip him up. So he managed that. It probably was a small cost, but Adams himself was a very helpful guy. And I'm sure he helped the vicar and curate himself in the village to pay for that, and presumably just paid for his food and so on. So I don't think that was particularly expensive. Next slide, please. This is the manganese mine. I've been there several times, and this is the current owner of the mine and guardian of it. Lives in there, you see. But what it is, it's almost open cast, but not really. There's a bump on Lidcott Farm, and because there are bumps in the ground, people know that there's been rocks have been pushed up from underneath and probably containing metal, therefore a granite type substance. And they also realized that water coming from that area was black. Now, black is the color of pyrolusite, which is the oxide of manganese. And so therefore, gosh, there must be manganese here. There is manganese around. So they went in and dug it out. And to be honest, the mine is flooded now. And I really wouldn't want to go in or send a diver down to see anything, because that would be very dangerous. But the water finds its way downhill all the way to into the Tamar. But nevertheless, that particular metal was used in hardening of steel for the railways. And so therefore it was a very good thing to have. Didn't make a huge fortune, but it certainly helped along the way. All right, okay, next please. Psychology crops up, I think, several times. Even astronomers believe what they want to believe. And there are a number of cases where this does come in the story. And there's one coming up now, which is actually more modern than that. Next slide. Thank you. That's Comet Halley. And there's a story that was wandering around the emails of friends of mine, and it flopped into my inbox. I'm not going to mention names here because it turned out to be a bit of a spoof, stating that Comet Halley was found in America weeks before it was recovered in Rome. And, whoa, gosh, I didn't know the Americans were that good. That's what everybody said. And of course, I realized that the Americans hadn't got huge numbers of big telescopes, whereas Europe was well populated with them. And of course, we'd found one or two asteroids as well along the way. So Comet Halley was a bit suspect to me. So I did some digging, and I find that although the guy that had written the paper, I'm sure acted in good faith, what they actually found was it was discovered in America several weeks before the news of its recovery from in Europe was made known to the American people. So it's not quite as people wanted, but nevertheless, it was a good piece of work. It was Olmsted that was the man that wrote the book or did the discovery in America. And he's a very unassuming guy by the look of it. And he actually said that very little about the comet in his book. I bought one of the original versions. And he just talks about Halley's Comet, doesn't say a word that they recovered it at the university. So it's a shame that. I think he should have plugged his own case a bit. Next, please. The search. How well did it go? Yes, well, went as well as one would expect. There were one or two things that did sort of come across the case quite badly. Was the fact that Chalice himself was very tired, I think, very overworked, and he was offered an assistant. Well, assistant wasn't quite the term, really. He got assistants. There was a goodly number of exchanges between Greenwich and Cambridge in the training field. But he actually was going to get a project leader come across from Greenwich. Somebody would take over the survey work and work with a couple of young assistants and get it done quickly. And of course, Chalice, quite rightly, really, I suppose, in his view, thought, well, I'm going to lose all control over what goes on and won't get any credit when it gets found, which is probably about the case, really. But nevertheless, that really was one reason why it failed. And also, of course, there was the comparing of the two sets of discovery days or nights, rather, on the 4th and the 12th when it was recorded twice. They compared it, but not all the way down. Apparently, if they'd gone on a few more stars, then the stars would in fact have, or the planet would have shown itself up very well. And of course, we know that he didn't exactly jump into action when he thought he saw a disc. Why on earth he didn't slap another eyepiece in at the time, I have no idea. As you notice,
Brian? Have you lost Brian again?
I'm not sure.
I think his internet's cut out again.
Oh, he's gone black again.
Have he? Okay. What do you want to do, John? Shall we just go through the questions again?
Yes, I think I put one up. You might be able to.
Yeah, hold on. Just let me stop the share and I can get to the questions. Okay.
I remember you telling me the story of some letters that we found down there, but I can't remember exactly what it was. Other people might be interested in that anyway.
Okay, let me get to where we were in the question list, otherwise I'm going to get confused.
Someone just said my grandma saw Halley's Comet twice. It must be a bit further up then.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, okay, I've got a question from David Love is the next one. It says, Leverrier seems to have been given a fairly precise forecast of the position of Neptune, but Adams's forecast seems to have been significantly less precise. Is that the case? Robert? You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, I should mention that Adams came up with some different results. And so the initial prediction, which was based on a fairly simple Bode's law estimate, circular Bode's law, was actually quite close to Leverrier's initial sketch, what he called a sketch. And it's actually the close agreement of the two that really galvanizes Airy and really drives Airy to get Chalice actually underway and searching. But later, when Adams was completing what was called Hypothesis 2, he actually made a slip. And so famously, Adams had intended to give a short presentation of his work at the British Association in September 1846. And that is the same meeting, if you remember, John Herschel gave an address to that meeting and talked about seeing the unseen planet as Columbus could see the Americas. Adams was planning to give a presentation there, but he turned up a day too late to give the presentation. You know, you pick up this kind of theme with Adams. He will go and visit John Herschel, but he leaves his umbrella behind. So he writes to Herschel, "Could you send on my umbrella?" And so if in fact Adams had given a presentation, because he'd made this slip, his estimate would have been quite distant, in fact, from the position of Leverrier and also the actual position where the planet was discovered. So in a way, in order to maintain his claim, it was perhaps even better for him that he had turned up a day late, because he would have given an announcement, "Here's my researches," and he would have been well away from the found position. But he later grasped that he actually made this error. And once he'd understood that, then his calculation was much better. But he, as I say, he made this initial slip with what was called his hypothesis 2. And let me just mention one other thing. I think I saw across the chat, there was a reference to a paper that was published in 2015 on Leverrier's calculations in the Journal for the History of Astronomy. And I strongly encourage, if you've not seen that paper, that's a very interesting paper, because one of the points it makes is, in fact, often people talk of Leverrier's prediction and the discovery position being within a degree. In fact, it was a bit more than a degree, but this is just one of the kind of examples. Often stuff around Neptune gets repeated almost endlessly. And so kind of breaking out from often these established positions is not so easy, becomes they kind of get entrenched. But that is just, I think, one example that in fact Leverrier was a bit more distant rather than a bit less distant than a degree in terms of where the planet was found.
And I think I'd like to add, it was also interesting when Kenneth Young looked back through the calculations that the example that both Leverrier and Adams gave, it could have also been correct for 180 degrees round in the other side of the orbit. And they were quite lucky that the examples, the results that they came to were so close to where Neptune was found, because there was two answers to the same mathematical question, which was quite interesting.
Yeah, and so that, I mean, it's worthwhile emphasizing that is, I think, a very interesting aspect of Chapter 9 by Kenneth Young and Bill Sheehan, where they look at that question, you know, was it a happy accident, which is what would be claimed by some American astronomers, principally Benjamin Peirce, in 1847. So you have this interesting situation where the tensions around Adams and Leverrier get diffused, but then onto the field of battle, as it were, having had the peace settlement agreed upon, we have claims that, both of them, in fact, really don't deserve credit. It was just a happy accident. And so that is also discussed a little bit in my chapter 7 as well as in chapter 9.
Okay. So the next comment came from David Strand, and I think it relates to the one before. It said, I'd always understood that it was the other way round. But I think
Brian is coming back in.
Okay, well, I think we'll carry on with the questions for a moment, and then
I think there's the one I put above that one you just read out. You've discovered some letters in. Is that right? Am I right about that, Cooch Adams?
I'm not sure, John. So there are all the records in the Cornwall archives. So
yeah.
I think Craig Wass went through most of those
Right.
in 2004, and that's when the half-written note was discovered. There is an absolute wealth of information in there, so there's enough to keep anyone busy. It's like, you know, when you go off and look into the Herschels, there's just an incredible amount of information there.
It resonated with me at the time when I discovered those letters in Somerset Archive. But anyway, okay, carry on with the. I think there are one or two more.
I've returned. Can you hear me? I'm returning to the fold here.
Yes, we've got you. Got you now.
What do you want to do, Brian? Do you want to carry on, or shall I carry on with some more questions?
Well, I'd like to finish off what I'm doing.
Yeah, okay. I shall.
The whole picture suddenly froze. It's taking me ages to unpick it.
Okay, I'll share your screen again, and you carry on if you can. I'm going to have to get back to the slide. There we go. Is that where you're happy with that slide? The search.
Oh yeah. Basically, I said, well, bearing in mind the people that were involved, was any other outcome expected? I don't know whether you got that bit. Did you, Carolyn?
Yeah.
Okay, next please. Next slide. Yeah, that's nice. That's one of the time roughly of the discovery, and we have left out all these sort of older pictures to it. Next, please. The other protagonists, and again, the court case that upset the Astronomer Royal. Now, I'm not mentioning any names on this, but Adam Airy was an exceptionally busy bloke. There's no question that he got far too many irons in the fire, but nevertheless, he battled on quite well. And then a court case upset him with one of his right-hand men actually getting arrested for a heinous crime. And that case took about the 6 months from the beginning of 1846 right the way through to June before it sorted itself out. Now, in spite of the fact that it doesn't appear to show up very much in the records, I'm sure it impacted on Airy because he was the sort of bloke that liked to do everything correctly and by the book. And he certainly wasn't supported by this particular guy. Next slide, please. This is reckoned to be Chris Lintot's favourite telescope. He's nicked it from me then. Thought it was my favourite telescope. And it is a powerful piece of kit. And of course, it was Airy that designed it and supervised the building of it. And of course, it's still working pretty well today. And there's no question that he was very keen that that particular telescope should be used in the discovery. Thank you. Next, please. Chalice, as you notice, he's got his fingers crossed here. That's about the size of it, I think. Most of the time he's being fairly careful. I think he's a decent bloke. He'd worked hard and he'd been through 3,000 or 4,000 stars and wasn't very fortunate, really. Next, please. Again, we'll move these fairly swiftly. And again. This is the discovery map that Gallet and Durest used, and that's where it's marked, the two positions predicted and discovered. And you can see the relative small number of stars there down to the magnitude of 7 or 8 or whatever. and fairly easy business to search that. And it was, I mean, obviously they couldn't see the disk. They managed to chase around and find the undistributed map, which I think would have really made it easy for Chalice, but I don't think he would have gone for it because it just doesn't show the number of stars that Airy was expecting him to look down to, magnitude-wise. Next, please. And that's the field of view that Airy, that Chalice rather, was trying to identify and measure the positions of each and every one of them. And that's down to the 11th magnitude. And that's a really formidable effort. And it was amazing that he did as well as he did, really. But you could see why he wasn't particularly keen on using an earlier map, which just didn't show enough stars. We had no reason to suspect that the Neptune would be as bright as it turned out to be. If it hadn't been an ice giant, but a terrestrial type planet, then it would have been much smaller and it would have been far less bright. Next, please. Yeah, in the aftermath, obviously, there was this discovery business and the naming of it. There's a bit of that sort of cropped up today as well. Let's see if I can find my right bit of paper here. There is a naming piece that comes in some of the books, but not many. The naming of the planet was controversial. A chap called Sir Henry Holland was a guy who sort of travelled around Europe, realised there had been this great discovery, and went off to Berlin to have a word with Encke and find out what had actually happened. He casually heard of the discovery and lost no time in hurrying to Berlin. And then he tried to see the planet, but naturally it clouded over. Frustrated in the main point, it was the stillness and darkness of the place, broken only by the solemn ticking of the astronomical clock, which is the unfailing interpreter of the celestial times and motions as a sort of living existence to the astronomer. Among other things we discussed while sitting around together was the name to be given to the new planet. Encke told me he had thought of Vulcan, but deemed it right to remit the choice to Leverrier, and then supposed the sole indicator of the planet and its place in the heavens. And he was expecting Leverrier's answer by the first post. Not an hour had elapsed before a knock on the door announced the letter expected. Encke read it aloud and coming to the passage where Leverrier proposed the name Neptune, and Lastan den Namen Neptune sign or something like that. It's a midnight scene not easily forgotten. A royal baptism with a long array of titles would ill compare with the simple naming of a remote and solitary planet, thus wonderfully rebuked and dwarfed into littleness as in the astronomical observatory. So I think there's no doubt about it that the name Neptune actually did come from Leverrier first. What happened was, of course, he got an awful lot of credit for it, and everybody was slapping him on the back and saying, well done, well done. And he thought, right, well, okay, let's see what we can do, and I'll call it Leverrier's planet, which he did, and that triggered a whole pile of contention in France and Europe in general. And it's never run smoothly, has the Neptune tale. But England tried not to be sort of totally left out. We know that LaSalle owned a 24-inch reflector up in Liverpool, and he was pointing his telescope at the planet, and he discovered the first sighting, actually, of the satellite Triton. And then from that, and from the data that was being accumulated, Adams calculated the true orbit ahead of Leverrier, and he was able to calculate a mass of Neptune from the wobbles with Triton, and he was able to identify a size as well. So we did do pretty well. Next, please. Of course, dear old Chalice, trying not to be outdone, he decides that he's going to have a really good look at this ring that Lassalle had predicted. And of course, he sees a ring. It's not there, but he's seen it. So that's another psychological hiccup, I'm afraid. But what we find is the ring was down to the fact that the speculum in Lassalle's telescope sort of bent slightly, and that produced the image of a ring that wasn't there. You don't get that in glass in quite the same way, but those of us which remember back to the 60s will know that in the Congo, there was a telescope called the Congo Schmet, and that's at Hurst-Monceau, and that's strangely enough is unusable because it was set up for the equator, which is where the Congo is, and it was propped up on its side, and the glass slumped over the years. I was trying to get it out and bring it down to Cornwall, but I was warned by experts from the Rutherford Appleton that not to bother with that. It was just too difficult. Next, please. What we do find is that we did manage to get the prime meridian for the world. That was against the French, wasn't it? Cool. We dashed off there, and why people wonder why it is that the Astronomer Royal of the day, which wasn't either Airy or Adams, wasn't the chief man to go and represent the UK. The point is that Adams was a positional astronomer, and Christie, the current Astronomer Royal, wasn't able to do that sort of work at all. So that's why Adams got the job, and he managed to talk his way out of everything. And we've got the prime meridian. The only people who didn't accept it were the French, but they've sort of come round now. Next, please. Yeah, that's the famous picture of it all. And this is obviously one of the older ones of Adams. He's right there. And we managed to get hold of a copy of that from a resident or descendant of the Adams family. Thank you. Next. The missing Greenwich file. Yeah, people wanted to do research. They wanted to study the original letters that were being sent to and fro. And for years, Greenwich couldn't find them. They had a fair idea where they'd gone. Another unnamed person had borrowed them to do some biographies. And he sloped off to Australia, and after that to Chile. And he died there, fortunately for us, or something like that. But he died out there, and when they opened his bungalow up, they discovered there were no less than 3 tea chests full of Greenwich and other rare materials lurking there. So Adam Perkins was the man. He was dispatched out there and brought them all back to the UK, and they've been found most usefully. Next, please. That is the image of them, and that's really, it's not like that anymore. What happened was they realized that wasn't a good idea. If people were going to study them, open all those pages up, the actual book would become a wreck. So they dismantled the folder it was in and laminated each and every letter. And they've done a really good job there, and it is available for people to study. But they keep a pretty close eye, because obviously nicking stuff from libraries is quite a common occurrence, really, tragically. Next, please. One of the things that followed on from the Neptune discovery, of course, was that the mass of Neptune wasn't enough to compensate for the wobbles that were being demonstrated. Well, that was the thought. So they whizzed out Voyager 2, and when it got to Uranus, it was able to measure the pull of Uranus on it and calculate a mass for Uranus. And when it got off to Neptune, did the same thing. And when they put the revised masses into the equations, the need for an additional planet disappeared. And so they need not have gone hunting out for Pluto, but nevertheless, it has opened our eyes to planets or objects beyond the really big ones that make up the solar system we know and love. I think that's about it for now. Next one. Yeah, nice picture. The famous Neptune image. Caroline's used one of the more modern ones, and I must try and get Per to sort that out, because they've taken some pictures nearly as good as that from planet Earth now. So that's an amazing tribute to the quality of today's telescopes. Next, please. This one was taken during the Seattle conference, look, and it's where I last saw Robert. And I think it's probably a good place to end there. You can go on one more slide and then people will be pleased. That's it. Oh dear, oh dear.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not quite sure why that second dropout occurred. I suddenly realised I was talking to myself.
Thank you, Brian. So we'll go back to the questions, because I can see there's quite a few more questions come in. And let me scroll back. Okay, so Carolyn has asked she's just commented to Robert about William Pearson's encounter with Argo. Pearson published a long letter refuting Argo's allegations against him, and it shed some light onto that, what you said. So Fernando has said, it is worth reading this article, and he's put a link there in the chat, everyone, to an article. And this is the article which is in the Journal of the History of Astronomy, which Robert just mentioned before. So that's there in the chat if everyone wants to grab that and download it before the end. Gerard wants to just put on the record that he wants to thank all the speakers. And I don't know if Gerald's done. No, he's still there. Okay. I wondered if you were dropping out then, Gerard. So Mike also wants to thank everyone and saying that thank tonight's speakers for giving their time to provide an interesting talk. David Brand has said fascinating. And John Rosenfield, my grandma saw Halley's Comet twice. Okay, we've got a question from Daniel. How did the Royal Astronomical Society respond to the discovery?
Who's going to field that one?
They had a big fight. They had a big fight over who was going to get the medals. And there was a dispute about the awarding of the RES gold medal, and that's what draws. I showed an image of Babbage, and that's and Babbage was on the council at the time, and that is where Babbage really gets fired up, and he's arguing about who should be getting the medal. Other members are arguing who should get the medal. Should they give it to Leverrier? Should they give it to Adams? Should they give it jointly? How should they go about things? And it's worthwhile, if we look a bit further on the RAS, the Royal Society award their Copley Medal, which was the most important medal that they offered, to Leverrier. And so Leverrier was awarded the Copley Medal, but then 2 years later, Adams got the Copley Medal. So I think in a way politically it was just impossible to award Adams, say, the Copley Medal and not award something to Leverrier. And the solution that they arrived at was give the Copley Medal to Leverrier and then give the Copley Medal a little bit later to Adams. So there are all sorts of negotiations going on about, you know, who's getting the credit, why should they get the credit? And I forget the precise outcome of the RAS gold medals, who gets what when, but it certainly leads to a big fight, and it's in newspapers, it's in the Times, for example. Babbage writes, then Airy responds in different publications as well to Babbage, because Airy and Babbage just do not get along. Airy had criticized and said Babbage's difference and analytical engines were basically worthless. And so here is a means, in a way, for Babbage to attack Airy. And so it's really a lot of verbal fisticuffs. Not just between, you know, some British figures and some figures in France, but also within Britain as well.
Okay. Our next comment is from David Purchase, who says, of no historical interest, but from time to time, Cambridge University Astronomical Society, founded 1942, had a group called the Chalice Group, which comprised present and former members of the committee of the society meeting socially. The joke was that the society was founded in 1942 because the blackout was the last time anyone could see stars in Cambridge. So I take it that the lights are pretty awful in Cambridge from that comment. I must say, when I was last at Cambridge for the FHA spring conference, I stayed right next to the where the conference hall is, and the PhD students came and got some of the telescopes working. Did they get the Northumberland working, Brian? You were there that night. And we did actually see some stars, but that was through a telescope, which is quite nice. So there is still opportunity, I think, to see some stars, probably not too many. Gerard Go LaSalle, yes, okay. I'm unsurprised by that. Thank you, Gerard. And so Jay has asked, I saw the picture of Washington House in Mount Vernon that Brian showed. What did this have to do with Neptune? Who was in the photo? So Brian, can you answer that?
Because there's been a bit of a to do as to what was Adams's legacy. He didn't really win the the Neptune story, and the one thing that is his sort of lasting legacy is the meridian at Greenwich. So that answers that question, really, that people have been asking, because he's done such good work. The secular acceleration of the moon is roughly the same as somebody else, I think. I'm not sure, but there are various other things that that he did. Adams did exceedingly well, but they haven't stood the test of time. But this one does. We still call it the prime meridian of the world.
Do you know who else was in the photo with him, Brian? Because he was stood with the beard at the about in the centre of the picture, and I could see that there was various women and men either side of him.
I don't know. I don't know whether anybody knows anymore.
Right. Okay.
Heard anybody claiming.
Okay, and then we've got someone saying, yes, I wondered that too. And then Daniel saying, thank you for the answer. And I think that is the end. Have I missed anyone? Is anyone going to speak up now if I've missed your question?
You haven't missed my question, but I have a short anecdote, which is, I think, be of some interest. When I was doing my doctorate at Sussex University, all the postgraduate students had to spend a fortnight at Hurstmonceux, which was then where the Royal Greenwich Observatory was, doing an observational course. And I did this in, I think, 1970. And during the day, of course, you couldn't observe. And I used to enjoy browsing in the library, which was extensive and lovely in this very old building. And at one end of it, there were old books. And I was just idly browsing and saw on the spine of one of them, Le Verrier. So I thought, oh, well, that'll be interesting. So I pulled it out, and it wasn't exactly falling to bits, but the leather was starting to perish. And it was a book by Le Verrier about, I think, the discovery of Neptune in French. But the really interesting thing was that on the flyleaf, handwritten, was something like "À mon cher ami, Monsieur John Adams, amicalement, Le Verrier."
Goodness me.
And I thought that was fantastic. Really, but now the library that was at Hurstmonceux, I believe, has now moved to Cambridge, and goodness knows what's happened to that book. But it might be worthwhile. I don't know, somebody, I suppose it should be me really, sometime, picking up the trail of that, because it would be an interesting document to see, don't you think? Apparently, Leverrier and Adams are very good friends, so I read. They both admire, they didn't want anything to do with the squabbling. I don't know, Robert, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I think Adams always recognized Leverrier's priority. He accepted that. And, you know, Agnes Clerk, the great historian of 19th century astronomy, actually wrote about, you know, what a gracious act this really was on Adams's part, that he'd had to live with this. But there is this moment that I mentioned at Oxford in 1847 at the British Association meeting, where you have these people get together and they're at dinner. You know, you have Leverrier, Adams, Airy, I forget the other people at the dinner, and somebody says, oh, let's go to the observatory and observe Neptune. And that's what they do. So you have Adams, Leverrier with Airy, and they're observing Neptune, which I think is, you know, if I could go back to 1847, I would like to be in the observatory with them. But
how much of a language problem, how much of a language barrier do you think there would have been, Robert?
well, there's a letter by one of the participants, and we know about this dinner and these events because Professor of Natural Philosophy at Edinburgh, J.D. Forbes, writes about it. And he said that Adams and Leverrier got along probably very well because Adams didn't speak French and Leverrier didn't speak English. So at least according to what Forbes wrote, they weren't really able to communicate that well.
Kind of help.
Yeah, and can I just mention one other point, that one of the things, amongst lots of other things that I had to leave on the cutting room floor, as it were, in pulling my talk together, is that there's a very interesting sonnet by one of the great mathematicians, and also he's not a great astronomer, but he's a great mathematician, William Rowan Hamilton. And he wrote a sonnet to Adams in February 1847. And if you go online, you can find this sonnet without a great deal of searching. You know, if you search William Rowan Hamilton, sonnet 1847, Adams or Neptune, and he calls, well, he has at the heading of this sonnet, on unselfishness in the pursuit of truth and beauty, and he dedicates the poem to Professor J.C. Adams, bracket, and he calls Adams discoverer of Neptune. He doesn't say co-discoverer, he says discoverer. And he's writing this in February 1847. And he sends a copy of this to Maria Edgeworth. And what Hamilton wrote was, let me just quote his words, perhaps I may be tempted to send a copy of this to Mr. Adams of Cambridge, who, having discovered the new planet as a truth, has to gracefully disclaim it as a possession. And so I think, you know, that summarizes things very nicely in many respects. And also, if you search a little bit more, you can get a poem by Hamilton's sister, who was actually a well-known poet. And Hamilton's sister wrote on the new planet Neptune as well. And that also is, I think, a very interesting piece. And so I would recommend taking a look at both Hamilton's sonnet and also the poem by Hamilton's sister as well. But this notion that that Adams had gracefully disclaimed the planet as a position, I think, is one that you see echoed really in the judgment by Agnes Clerk who knew Adams, and so she was writing this after Adams had died. That, you know, this had, in a way, had been a noble act by him.
Thank you. So there's just some final comments about this book, whether it's in Cambridge or Greenwich, but I think people are going to check now. So I would be very interested if it's found to, and so would Jay, to have a photograph of that inscription in the book, and I'd be happy to pass it around anyone if you let me know. And then there's a comment from DVG about the PhD student at the Paris Observatory who is looking through the calculations of Leverrier. And I know we were in contact with them at the Paris Observatory about that happening while we were writing the book. And yes, we understood that was going on, and we're all looking forward to seeing some of those results that come out of that. So the story probably isn't finished. But hopefully we've given it a massive revamp and brought it forward with all the new information that's been found over the last couple of decades and things. With that, if there's no more questions, I'm going to thank Robert and Brian. So thank you both for your time, and everyone's muted, so it's very quiet clapping going off.
Can I just have a quick word?
Yes, go on, Brian.
Yes, I want to thank everybody for on the team, because they worked exceedingly hard. Carolyn herself has spent endless hours indexing. I know that Robert has read the book from cover to cover at least twice to sort out any typos and errors and so on. And it's all we've got to do now is make for the hundreds and thousands of pounds that will roll in our way, as if it were not. We shall not make a penny piece out of it.
Don't hold your breath.
No, nothing coming from that particular type of work. If we had written a scurrilous novel, I'm sure it would have made lots of money, but serious.
You should turn your attention to that one next, Brian. You could do.
Yes. Well, thank you everybody for attending and sticking to the hiccups along the way. I really don't know quite what happened that second time. I still don't. It just sort of died on me.
Caroline, can I just repeat my thanks on behalf of Council and all the membership in my position as chairman. Again, my thanks to Robert, Brian and yourself, and to everybody involved in the production of the book. I can't wait for it to be in my hands. It is on order. It's been like Christmas really, so I can't wait to read it. So thank you to everybody. And we've had a fantastic attendance this evening. It's been brilliant. So to John and also to Mike White for the admin of the webinar, putting aside Brian's technical problems, it just gives me wishful thinking that we should hopefully be back face to face one day, whenever that is. So just to say thank you very much indeed on behalf of everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you,
Everyone.
So I think we can say good night and look after yourselves, and I wish you good health.
Okay.
Until we meet again, good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Stay safe.
Caroline, thank you.